Hi everybody, welcome back to CMN 153. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 17th of August. And if you look at the notes below, I have a link for you about some writing tips because we're getting close to the ending of the semester, and that means that we are getting close also to the due date for our final project. And while you can utilize media to actually examine media, it seems, at least from the feedback that I've gotten from most of you, is that you are going to be doing traditional papers, which is perfectly fine. And there are lots of resources that you can use to help you with your writing, but this one in particular is called Purdue OWL, and you might be familiar with it. It's from Purdue University, but it's accessible to the general public, and it goes through the entire process of writing. So if you needed some review about elements of writing, this is a great site. I also am going to be posting on our Moodle site in the top section under the syllabus and other documents folder, a handout that I distribute in my English classes about writing. And this was a handout that was actually given to me when I was an undergraduate many moons ago. And it talks about the process of writing. And I just wanted to briefly review that with you. I suspect that you've already gone through all of this in your previous English classes as well. But that basically the handout that I'm posting on Moodle talks about writing in 3 steps: the planning step, the writing step, and then finally the presentation step. The planning step is what most people skip. They go straight to the writing step and they make things much more difficult for themselves. So really spend some time thinking and brainstorming and trying to generate ideas. And you can see that this handout is specifically addressing Shakespeare and Shakespeare's Hamlet, but that's not to say that it couldn't be applied to basically any paper. Remember, you're analyzing. You're not summarizing. You need a thesis. That's a position that reasonable people could disagree about, and usually it's stated in the beginning of the work. You have paragraphs that follow body paragraphs that provide evidence and details. The first sentence of all of those paragraphs are known as topic sentences, and they, more often than not, if it is a well-written paragraph, they summarize what the paragraph is about. So you could actually read the first sentences of all of your paragraphs or anybody's writing. And again, if it's well written, you should have a kind of summary, which is very nice if you're reading something like a textbook. You need to have evidence, basically thinking about my position is to take the opposite viewpoint. So even if I agree with you, I need to take the opposite viewpoint. So you need to provide enough evidence in order to support your particular position. And you want to find an interesting way to conclude. By that point, students are usually, and writers are usually tired and they feel like they've said everything. So you don't want to just alter a few words from your introduction, or again, you want to think about the elements of a paragraph. A paragraph should be at least 3 sentences long, and preferably much longer, but it needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that includes your conclusion. Now, writing. The first principle of good writing is economy, and the second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. Basically, you hope that there's enough time after you've constructed a piece of writing that you can go through your sentences and see if you can reduce wordiness and repetition. Generally speaking, if you can make a sentence shorter and not sacrifice its meaning, you should try to make it shorter. Make sure that you're varying your sentences, some long ones and some short ones. A lot of short sentences together, it sounds pretty choppy. A lot of long sentences together, it can sound very dense. Vary the sentence beginnings as well. You don't want to have multiple sentences that are starting in the same way or with the same word. Avoid cliches or trite expressions, overused expressions. The grass is always greener on the other side of the the lawn, or it's raining cats and dogs, or something of that nature, you want to try to use what's considered to be standard academic English, which is also the language of business, which is how you can translate over and transfer over what you are writing about in college and use those same skills for the world of business and the world of workplace. So if you are going to be using outside resources, then you do need to have a works cited page. And that is a page at the ending of your paper where you are literally listing all of the works that you've cited or you've quoted from. Since this is a communications class, it is in the humanities, and the humanities uses the system of the Modern Language Association, MLA, for documentation, which means that when you are quoting, at the ending of a quote within the body of your paper, but before you end your sentence, but immediately following the quote, you use parentheses. And inside of those parentheses, you indicate where that quote can be found. And you use the least amount of information for a reader to be able to figure out where that quote appears. So at the very least, it would be something like a page number. But again, it depends. If it's not clear what text you're referencing, you might need to use, let's say, part of the title of the text and the page number. And if you've got multiple titles by the same author, you might need to have additional information as well. So it depends on what the situation is. But basically, again, all of this can be reviewed in Purdue OWL as well as the GCC website. And the GCC website for the library. And of course, you can always contact me as well. You're not necessarily required to use outside resources, but if you do use outside resources, then you definitely want to document those outside resources. And again, you want to use the MLA system or the Modern Language Association system. And if you go on the GCC library site, you'll see that they have a tab there just for writing research papers and for documentation. And basically, you just look up the system and you follow the rules. The rules can be very detailed. So there's a slightly different way for indicating something that came from a website, as opposed to something that came from a book, as opposed to something that came from a magazine article, as opposed to something that came from a television program. And again, you just follow their guidelines, almost like following a recipe, if you will, in terms of your works cited page and in terms of how you document within the body of the paper. That's called parenthetical documentation, because you're using parentheses at the ending of a quote to indicate where that quote came from. Something like a page number, or it could be the author and page number, or it could be the author and the title and the page number, depending on the situation. But the least amount of information necessary so that you can clarify and also allow your reader to verify that the information you're sharing is indeed accurate. That's the whole point of documentation. So the last step is the presentation step, the proofreading step, and this is also a step that most writers skip because by that point they've literally just run out of time because they've waited too long. So I encourage you to get started now if you haven't already gotten started. And they basically have run out of energy as well. So you want to save a little something for the end. If you have trouble when you are proofreading, one tip might be to read backwards. You start with the last sentence of your writing and you work your way all the way to the beginning of the writing. And of course, the content won't make sense, but the idea is that you're really focusing on the sentences and the grammatical structure so that you can edit. You do need to have some sort of a title, and the title should not necessarily be the title of a work that you're examining. So for instance, if you wanted to do a final project on Citizen Kane, you wouldn't want to call it Citizen Kane. That title's already been taken by the movie. Now you can examine something like Power Dynamics and Citizen Kane. That could be a title. And basically the titles of plays and novels and long poems and movies, those are either underlined or italicized. And then the titles of shorter works that can appear in something larger, let's say short stories or short poems or podcasts or things of that nature, in quotation marks. And that's how you differentiate something that's been published as opposed to something that is not published, something that you are writing on your own that hasn't been published. And if you're reading along with the handout that I had included at the top of the Moodle site, you'll probably chuckle at its age because it says instructors prefer typewritten papers, obviously. It's got to be typed, double space, 1-inch margins. Again, pretty standard, and you can find that in the MLA with a title page that basically just lists the title of the paper, your name, my name, and the due date. So again, what you want to do is start thinking carefully about the final project as we're nearing the ending of the semester. That also means that we have a final exam. And the final exam for this class is going to be an open book, open notes essay exam, talking about the topics that we've been examining over the course of the entire semester. And you will have choice. I'll give you a handful of essay questions and ask you to select two. If we were doing this in person, you would have 3 hours to take this examination if you needed those 3 hours. But basically, you should assume that you're doing 3 hours or less for the exam. And what I'm going to do for the final is when I post it is I'll give you 24 hours in which to respond to that. But again, I don't expect you to spend 24 hours actually working on that exam. And I'm quite aware that what you would write for a final wouldn't be as neat or polished as something that you might write for a journal or something that you might write for a final project. And I'm expecting that. So where we are is that we were finishing with movies and Citizen Kane, and I'm not too surprised that most of you indicated that you weren't particularly impressed with Citizen Kane. I think I shared with you that I too was not particularly impressed with Citizen Kane when I first viewed this movie as a freshman in college at the age of 18. I can tell you now that Citizen Kane is one of my favorite movies, perhaps my favorite movie of all time. As I've continued to examine this movie, and I've seen this movie dozens of times by now, I always find something new and interesting about that film. It's very similar to when you're examining literature, and that you are, with a good piece of literature, always finding something new and interesting. And I think that the reason why I didn't like the film when I was a freshman is I didn't really understand it. I didn't understand how revolutionary it was for its time in terms of its cinematography, things that we just take for granted nowadays, like being able to show a ceiling in a shot, or having aging characters, or overlapping dialogue. All of that was considered very revolutionary for the time. The camera angles, the use of shadow, again, just brilliant. It's a beautifully filmed film. And then also from a literary standpoint, it's got lots of symbolism. It's got lots of imagery. There's a lot to dissect there. Right from the very beginning with the no trespassing sign that we see at the end as well, and the ideas that we are trespassing on Citizen Kane's life, and we're never going to get an objective account. It's very subjective because we've got narrative embedded within narrative embedded within narrative in there, all of these different accounts of who Kane is. And one of my favorite quotes in the film happens to be that it's not that difficult to earn a lot of money if that's all you want to do is earn a lot of money. And I think that's one of the many lessons in this particular film. It, of course, touches on the idea of media and media moguls. And while you might say, well, we don't have a William Randolph Hearst in today's world, we are not that far removed from Rupert Murdoch. And you might say that our new media mongols are really our technology giants, the Amazon.coms, Jeff Bezos, and the Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg's of the world, and that there are a good number of parallels between them and what we would see with someone like a William Randolph Hearst or Citizen Kane. The controversy also associated with the film and how it led to the destruction of Orson Welles' career. There's just a lot of interesting things about this particular film. So even something as simple as the jigsaw puzzles that Citizen Kane's mistress and eventually his wife happens to do. I mean, this whole film is a jigsaw puzzle. We're trying to put together the pieces. So I encourage you not to dismiss this film, and hopefully to view it one day again in the future really carefully. And I can guarantee that the more times you watch this film, which is in many ways a multi-genre film. I mean, you've got a film that is a drama, but you've also got a love story in here, and you've also got a musical in here as well, when you see those dance and singing scenes. And a mystery story too, and trying to uncover what Rosebud is. A little bit of trivia here, but again, I believe that would have been covered in the videos that I asked you to watch, but if it wasn't, I can't recollect off the top of my head. Rosebud happened to be the pet name William Randolph Hearst had for his mistress's private parts. So this stung him particularly deeply that Rosebud played such a prominent role in the film. Of course, that's the spoiler, is that Rosebud is Cain's sled from when he was a child. In other words, all of his money was meaningless. All he really wanted was family and love, which he had as a young child. But we move forward to television. And basically what television was able to do was to provide the experience of movies, but within our own homes. And one of the ways that movies differentiated themselves from television is that movies became more risque because they could deal with more adult content matter, because they could basically determine who would gain entrance into the theaters, as opposed to something like a television, which at the time when television was invented, these were just large pieces of furniture, almost like radios were back in the old days of radios, that would take a central spot, perhaps in a living room, and the entire family would have access to that. So the programming had to be much more generalized for all ages and all demographic groups. And the heyday of television would probably be the 1960s to the 1980s. And this would be my time, basically. I was a teenager in the 1980s. And television was the dominant media force. We didn't have all of the other options that we've got today in terms of media. Certainly we had things like magazines and movies. But what made television so uniquely different is that individuals, masses and masses of individuals, millions, sometimes billions, which is what we saw with the spacewalk, could be consuming the same visual and the same audio at the same time. It was a shared cultural experience. It was something that we all had in common. Because there were so few options with television stations, mostly three major networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and eventually in the 90s, Rupert Murdoch introduced Fox, so that became the fourth network. But basically, there was a very high probability that lots of people were all watching the same television show at the same time. It was a way that individuals could unite through conversation after the show. The kind of workplace dialogues that might occur around the water cooler. Did you see this episode of blankety blank? And so forth. And of course, we know that TV profited from advertising and still does, even though the world of advertising has changed quite a bit since television's heyday. Cable profited both from advertising and subscriptions. And of course, cable allowed things like better transmission quality, more diverse programming. It could also be more specialized, and much like movies, it could be directed towards particular demographics. The idea is that if your household was paying for a subscription, then they were consenting to the fact that there could be more adult content, for instance, on some stations. And it could very much duplicate the storytelling power of film, which we saw and still continue to see with cable stations such as HBO, for instance, that have their own unique programming. And of course, now we see that with Netflix, and they're also creating their own unique programming. So this mass simultaneous communal experience is something that I don't think we will ever experience again. Maybe we would during a Super Bowl, which tends to have incredibly high ratings. And we talked about the Super Bowl a little bit when it came to advertising, where some people watch the Super Bowl, believe it or not, just for the new ads that are revealed during the Super Bowl. 1984 ad being the historical ad that I talked about for Apple computers. And of course, we know how Apple basically transformed the world, first through computers and then through smartphones. Or sadly, if there's some sort of a huge significant tragedy, I think people would be consuming in masses, but still not to the extent I think that they would have done during this time period. I think about something like 9/11, and my first go-to reaction, I first found out about 9/11 through the radio. Actually, I was in a workplace setting where I was able to hear radio broadcasts, and my first gut reaction was, I need to get to a television. I need to verify this by seeing these visuals. If it happened today, my first gut reaction would be, I need to go on the internet and I need to verify these visuals. So you can see how things have changed just for me personally over the last 2 decades. It's one of the things actually that some of you talked about when we were discussing radio and why it was that the War of the Worlds broadcast led to such panic, that people didn't have visuals that they could verify with. But keep in mind the story I told you about the Discovery Channel and the Megalodon, where they were broadcasting what was a fictional or faux documentary, but if people had missed the disclaimer at the beginning, and many did, it seemed quite realistic, and the visuals and of course the audio made it seem like it was very valid. And we certainly live in an era where image can be manipulated, so that just because you're seeing an image, that doesn't necessarily mean that that image is real or valid. So we live in particularly complex times. But nevertheless, thinking about the history of television, it started in the early 1900s, and this is where we would have the cathode ray tube, the transmission of both audio and visuals using radio waves, analog from a transmission point, a television station, to a reception point, a TV set. And then in 1934 was the first public demonstration of television in Philadelphia. In 1939 was RCA's public TV demonstration at the New York World's Fair, and it was considered to be this revolutionary new invention. In the 1940s, cable wires were beginning to be used for signal transmission in places like Oregon and New York and Pennsylvania, where TV signals were being blocked by mountains and buildings. So that was the origin of cable. And then, of course, cable transformed as a way just to get better reception everywhere, regardless of locale. 1950s to 1960s, communication satellites in space were used for signal amplifications. In 1970s, this is where we got HBO, home box office, the first cable network to use satellites. And they specialized in narrowcasting, specialized programming for specific demographic groups. In the 1980s is where we had pay-per-view also, and that's where you could pay a certain number of dollars to get specific programming from a cable site. Oftentimes they were sporting events. In the 2000s is when we had video on demand, and this led to the beginning of time shifting, where you didn't necessarily have to consume a program at a particular time. You could elect when. And of course, we've taken this to the extreme when you think about things like binge watching nowadays. And then in the 2010s, of course, is when we get our convergence, and this is where we've got computers and mobile device streaming, which is where we find ourselves now. And of course, television at the time, it referred to the device as well as the programming. Now you can consume television on multiple kinds of devices. It doesn't have to be a television set, but it can still be programming that's devoted to television. And television still has a hold in our society, but certainly not to the extent that it would have in its heyday in the 1980s, which actually the highest watched television program in the 1980s would be the season finale for a comedy sitcom called MASH, which happened to be a kind of a drama comedy. It was a mixture of two genres there about doctors in the Korean War. It was very highly acclaimed and very well done. And I do remember in the 1980s where a soap opera by the title of General Hospital, which actually is still on today, led to mass viewers. This would be the most watched television program during the daytime for two of the soap opera characters by the name of Luke and Laura and their marriage. And this was such a phenomenon that a pop song was written about it by Christopher Cross called Laura. It was such a phenomenon that colleges across the United States were rescheduling classes that would normally be held at 3 o'clock, because 3 o'clock was when General Hospital aired, and they had low student attendance and enrollment because everybody was watching General Hospital and was watching Luke and Laura, as myself included. I saw Luke and Laura's wedding. I wasn't in college yet. I was in high school, but I did watch that. So at any rate, moving forward to the 1950s, this is when we get color television, and this was where we would shift from single sponsor programming to multiple sponsors, where ultimately one sponsor would sponsor a particular program, and they would be responsible for the payment for that program. And individuals realized that if that sponsor ended up going out of business, that also meant the program was in financial difficulty. So it would be better to have multiple sponsors, and that's where we get the idea of the modern commercial, where you have multiple products that are being sold. And prime time at the time was viewed as 8 to 11 p.m. That those would be the times where most television consumption would occur. Now, in the 1950s is where we were beginning to have some scandals with television, one being a quiz show scandal, where people were horrified to find out that one of their favorite quiz shows had been rigged, had been fixed. This was also the time, 1950s, is where old radio programs were being repurposed for television programs. So TV did a good amount of stealing, I suppose that's really the only way to say it, from radio. And that's usually what happens with the newer medium. It takes from the older medium. So if you think about a very famous sitcom like I Love Lucy in the 1950s, it began as a radio drama or a radio comedy, and basically radio was devoted to programming and less so to music. Once the programming was stolen by television, that's when radio began to really focus on the idea of music. It was also the heyday of anthology dramas. If you've ever seen the old Twilight Zones, which are excellent because they were written by some of the great short story writers of the day. So they really are quite literary and have a good amount of quality to them. And contemporary programming, even though we've got a lot of reality programming, and the reason why it happened to do with a writer's strike, actually, that was occurring. And it was too difficult to basically hire scabs. So the reality program basically became a very popular way for broadcast stations to be able to air original content that didn't rely on writers. Though, of course, you know anything about reality program, it's not real in the sense that there is a certain amount of staging and there is a certain amount of writing that also goes on for reality programming. But you don't have to pay big stars big money. Again, this was before the Kardashians and all of the rest. And it turned out to be very lucrative. But reality programming goes all the way back to things like the 1960s with the television show called Candid Camera, where pranks were being played on unsuspecting people and were being filmed. And then afterwards it was revealed that they were on Candid Camera, and then they signed a release, and then you could watch that. Survivor was a very important reality show that came out in the early 2000s. Just because of the number of viewers who were watching that show, it became really mainstream. And in fact, one of the things I'm going to ask you to do today is to watch a YouTube clip about TV's 100 most important moments. And one of those clips actually happens to be from the season finale of Survivor. There also is a clip from the television show I was mentioning earlier, MASH, as well as other clips. So the 1960s is where we get public television. The idea that television and radio, when we talk about things like National Public Radio, has a responsibility to forward the public good. This is also where we got the first televised presidential debate between Nixon and Kennedy. This was an incredibly important debate because it really changed the way debates and presidential elections were held. These were the early days of television, so approximately half of the audience listened to the debate on the radio and the other half watched the debate on television. What pollsters found after the fact, very interesting, that the majority of individuals who heard the debate on the radio said that Richard Nixon had won because of his presentation and argumentation of topics. But the majority of individuals who watched the debate on television said the exact opposite and said that Kennedy won the debate because he appeared calm and presidential. So, and also Kennedy is very photogenic, and Nixon was not photogenic. Nixon was known to visibly sweat in hot areas, and that's definitely what you've got in a television studio underneath those lights. And Nixon also declined wearing makeup, not understanding the importance of makeup for television. Kennedy accepted. If you know anything at all, again, about television, if you don't wear makeup, you look really washed out. So there were lots of reasons for individuals to respond the way they did with seeing the visuals as opposed to just listening to the auditory, or to the audio. But at that point is really when presidential elections changed, and it became much more about image than it became about content. And we've suffered badly because of that, in my personal opinion. This is when journalists were given a high level of esteem as well. In 1960s, the journalist with perhaps the most esteem was Walter Cronkite, viewed as a trusted news source. And his public opposition to the Vietnam War helped to actually end the war. So a journalist helped to end the war. 1969 is also where we saw the first man on the moon, where we've got 650 million plus global viewers. I suspect it was probably closer to 1 billion viewers watching the first man on the moon broadcast. So it gives you an idea about the incredible reach of television and the way that it could unite individuals. In the 1970s is where we get cable local access channels. Again, the idea that television is supposed to serve a greater good, so therefore there should be channels and frequencies that are devoted to local communities. This is with the heyday of the TV miniseries, perhaps the most famous being Roots, and it educated an entire populace about slavery. The 1980s is where you would have the heyday of soap operas, and not just soap operas during the day like General Hospital, which I was referencing earlier, but also soap operas during that prime time period of 8 to 11, such as Dallas. And again, in that video I'm going to ask you to watch, there is a snippet from the television show Dallas. The big question was, who shot a character by the name of J.R.? And this was the season cliffhanger. So months basically went by before the answer was revealed, and that meant lots of conversation about this one particular topic. It was also where cable news began, CNN, and we certainly saw what has occurred with cable news. Again, that 1983 MASH finale, there were over 1 million viewers watching at that point in time. So that has the highest ranked viewership. The 1990s is where we get our video recording and the ability to begin time shifting. And then the 2000s is where we've got our reality television. And then the 2010s are media conversion. So basically you can see how all of this is related to what I'm going to ask you to watch now. It's approximately, I believe, 25 minutes or so. 100 memorable TV moments. And basically you are going to be watching 100 memorable TV moments. Of course, this is subjective, just like the greatest movie ever made is subjective as well. for your attendance question, which will be due on Wednesday, the 18th at 1 p.m. I want you to identify 3 television clips from 100 memorable TV moments that illustrate, or what you think illustrate, a particularly interesting cultural moment, and talk about why those clips illustrate that particularly interesting cultural moment. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Next class, we will continue on and we will talk about music and some of my rationale about why I put music at that particular point in the semester. And then we have just one more unit left, and that's digital gaming, before we get to our final exam. So again, hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and I will see you next class, so to speak. Take care. Bye-bye.